Everyone was smiling when my father slid the cabin keys across the table toward my sister. She didn't even reach for them right away. She just looked at them, then looked at me, and smiled the way she always smiled when she knew she'd already won. That was the moment I understood that nothing I had ever done mattered to this family. Not really. My name is Paige, and I was 34 years old the night my grandmother's lakeside cabin stopped being mine. I say mine loosely. It was never officially mine, but I grew up believing that it would be the way you believe certain things when you're young, and the adults around you say them enough times. My grandmother used to sit with me on the dock after supper, our feet dangling over the water, and she'd say, "Paige, this place has your fingerprints all over it." I didn't know what she meant then. I thought she was just being affectionate. Now I think she was telling me something she couldn't say plainly. The cabin sat on a small lake about 2 hours north of Toronto, in a part of Ontario where the trees crowd close to the water, and the loons call out so clearly at night that you can hear them from every room in the house. My grandmother had bought the property in the late 1970s with money she'd saved over nearly a decade working as a bookkeeper for a small manufacturing company in Mississauga. She'd paid cash. She told me that once quietly, like it was a private thing between us. She said she's never wanted to owe anyone a single dollar on that land. She kept it immaculate. Every summer, she'd repaint the trim herself, white over white, even when her knees started making it hard to climb. She knew every tree on the property by some private system of her own. She knew which floorboard creaked, and she never had it fixed because she said she liked knowing when someone was coming. I spent every summer of my childhood there. My sister did too, technically. But she stopped coming once she hit her early teens. Too quiet, too many bugs. She wanted to be in the city, at the pool, somewhere with people and noise. I never questioned it. I just kept going back to the cabin, summer after summer, long into adulthood. I drove up for Thanksgiving weekends. I went alone in November sometimes, just to sit on the dock and watch the water go gray. My sister, Amber, had built a very different life. She married well, as my mother liked to say, which in our family meant she'd married someone with a finance job and a downtown condo, and a name that got a certain kind of nod at certain kinds of dinner parties. His name was Cody. He wore quarter-zip sweaters, unironically, and had opinions about espresso. I'm not being unfair, I'm being precise. Amber and I were not close. We were polite, the way sisters can be polite when they've long since stopped pretending to understand each other. At family dinners, we spoke about safe things. Her kids, my work, the weather, whatever was happening in the news. We did not talk about the cabin. I didn't realize, for a long time, that this was deliberate on her part. My grandmother passed in February, which felt right in some bleak way. She hated long goodbyes, and February in Ontario is not a month that encourages lingering. She died at home, in her own bed, at 81, which was exactly the kind of exit she would have planned for herself if she'd had the option. I flew in from Vancouver, where I'd been living for the past 3 years working as a project coordinator for a mid-sized construction firm. I'd been saving. I had a plan. Part of that plan involved the cabin. The weeks after her death moved strangely. There were arrangements to make, a small service at the United Church she'd attended for 40 years, a reception at my parents' house, where people ate egg salad sandwiches and said things like, "She was so sharp right to the end." She was. That was true. My father handled the estate. He was her son, the executor, and he took the responsibility seriously. He went through her documents, met with the family lawyer, organized everything with the quiet efficiency he brought to most practical matters. He didn't share details with us while the process was ongoing. He said he wanted to make sure everything was in order before there were any conversations. I respected that. I waited. The dinner happened in April, about 6 weeks after the service. My parents asked both of us to come, Amber and me, for a Sunday dinner at their house in Oakville. Nothing formal, my mother said on the phone. Just family. Come hungry. I drove from the airport. I'd flown in that morning specifically for this. Something in my mother's voice had made me think it was important to be there in person. Amber arrived 20 minutes after me, which she often did. She breezed in with Cody behind her, carrying a bottle of Niagara Pinot Noir, kissed my mother on the cheek, hugged my father, smiled at me with that particular quality of smile that never quite reached her eyes. We made small talk in the kitchen while my mother finished the roast. Amber told a story about her daughter's hockey tournament in Barrie. My father laughed at the right moments. I set the table. Dinner was good. It was genuinely good. My mother made the roast she'd been making since I was 8, with roasted carrots and mashed potatoes and gravy from the drippings, and for a little while it felt almost normal. Like we were just there for Sunday dinner. Like nothing was pending. After the plates were cleared and the coffee was poured, my father reached into the folder he'd set beside his chair at the start of the meal. I'd noticed it when I came in. I hadn't said anything. He pulled out a single page and set it on the table. He said, "I want to talk about the cabin." Amber set down her coffee cup. I watched her hands. My father explained that my grandmother had left the cabin to him as part of the estate, with the expectation that he would handle its distribution within the family. This was not a surprise. What he said next was, he said he and my mother had talked about it at length. They felt that the cabin should stay in the family and be used. They felt that Amber and Cody, with the kids, would make the most use of it. They felt that I had built my life in Vancouver and probably didn't need a property in Ontario tying me down. He said all of this carefully, the way you say things you've rehearsed, with a gentleness that doesn't quite cover the shape of what's underneath. Then he slid a set of keys across the table toward my sister. Amber looked at them. Then she looked at me and she smiled. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. The smile said everything that had been quietly true in our family for years. She had always been the one they pictured in that cabin. In every future they imagined, she was the one standing on the dock. I did not cry. I want to be clear about that. I sat very still, and I looked at the keys on the table, and I thought about the summer. I was 11 years old, and I helped my grandmother restack the woodpile after a storm knocked it over. We spent an entire afternoon doing it. She showed me how to stack it so it would stay. I thought about that. Then something happened that nobody at the table expected. The front door opened. We all turned. My father looked confused. My mother half stood from her chair. A woman walked in. She was in her mid-60s, composed, wearing a gray blazer and carrying a slim briefcase. She had short silver hair and the kind of stillness about her that comes from spending a lot of years in rooms where people are emotional, and she is required to be the opposite. My mother said, "Eleanor?" The woman nodded. She said she was sorry to interrupt the dinner. She said she had been asked to come at this time, and that she hoped they would give her a few minutes. Her name was Eleanor Marsh. She was my grandmother's lawyer. Not the family lawyer my father had been working with, but a different one, my grandmother's own. My father said, slowly, "I wasn't aware my mother had separate legal representation." Eleanor Marsh opened her briefcase. She said, "She retained me in 2019. She was very specific about the timing of this. She removed a document, a thick envelope, sealed with a sticker that bore my grandmother's signature across the seal. The kind of thing you do when you want it to be absolutely clear that nobody has opened it. She asked that this be read aloud at the first family gathering after the estate executor had made his decision about the cabin." Nobody spoke. Amber's hand moved toward the keys. Then it stopped. Eleanor Marsh broke the seal carefully. She unfolded several pages, printed in a large, clear font that I recognized immediately as my grandmother's accommodation for her own failing eyesight in her later years. She had typed this herself. I was certain of it. Eleanor began to read. My grandmother's voice came back to me through someone else's mouth, and it was almost unbearable in the most specific way. Not grief, exactly, but something adjacent to it. Recognition. The rhythm of her sentences, the way she never used two words when one would do. She wrote, "If you are hearing this, then my son has made a decision about the cabin, and Eleanor is in the room. I want you to know that I planned for this carefully, and I want you to understand why. She wrote. The cabin was never meant to be a gift for whoever seemed most convenient or most present. It was meant to go to the person who understood what it actually is. Amber shifted in her seat. My father put down his coffee cup. Eleanor continued reading. My grandmother had made her own arrangements. Not in contradiction of my father's authority as executor, but around it. In 2019, quietly, she had established a separate property trust. The cabin was placed into that trust. My father's estate documents covered her liquid assets, her furniture, her personal belongings. But the cabin had not been his to distribute. It had never been in the estate. I heard Amber make a sound that wasn't quite a word. The trust, Eleanor read, named a sole trustee with full management authority and right of use. That trustee had full discretion over access, rental decisions, maintenance, and any future disposition of the property. Eleanor lowered the pages. She looked at me directly. Paige, she said, you are the named trustee. I don't know how long the silence lasted. It felt long. It might have been 5 seconds. Amber turned and looked at me with an expression I'd never seen on her face before. Not anger, not right away. Something more like vertigo, like the floor had just moved. My father said, very quietly, that's not possible. Eleanor said gently, I'm afraid it's fully documented. The trust was legally registered in Ontario in September of 2019. I have the original filing here. She removed a second document from her briefcase and set it on the table. You're welcome to have your own counsel review everything. But the property transfer was completed years ago. My mother said nothing. She was looking at the roast pan she'd forgotten to take back to the kitchen, the way you look at an ordinary thing when you need something ordinary to look at. Amber said, Why would she do this? Eleanor returned to the letter. My grandmother had written, Amber, I love you. I want you to know that clearly and without condition. But love is not the same as trust, and the cabin requires trust. It requires someone who will protect it the way I protected it. Someone who understands that some things are not meant to be renovated or rented out on long weekends or used as a backdrop for photographs. Some things are meant to be tended. She had written. Paige has been tending this property her whole life without being asked to. She drove up in November to check the pipes before the hard freeze. She called the roofer when I couldn't manage the ladder anymore. She stacked wood and patched screens and sat on that dock for 30 years because she wanted to, not because anyone asked her to. That is who I trust with this place. My throat did something complicated. I pressed my lips together and breathed through it. Eleanor read one more passage. My grandmother had written, I am not punishing anyone. I am protecting something I love by leaving it with someone who loves it back. The room was quiet for a long time after Eleanor stopped reading. Amber stood up. She walked to the kitchen without saying anything. I could hear her in there, running the tap, the way you do when you need a moment and there's nowhere private to take it. Cody sat very still with his hands flat on the table. My father looked at Eleanor Marsh with an expression that was trying to decide between several different feelings. My mother finally got up and brought the roast pan back to the kitchen. Eleanor finished her documentation. She explained, professionally and without editorializing, the legal standing of the trust, the process by which I would formally accept the trustee role, and what my responsibilities would be. She answered my father's questions patiently. She answered them twice, actually, because the first time through I don't think he fully absorbed the answers. When Amber came back from the kitchen, she sat down. She didn't look at the keys anymore. Someone had moved them to the edge of the table. I wasn't sure who, she said finally. Did you know? I said, no. She looked at me for a long time. I met her eyes. I wasn't going to look away from that question because the honest answer was the only one I had. She said, all those weekends you drove up there, I said. I went because I wanted to be there. She was quiet again. Then she said something I didn't expect. She said, I know, just that. 2 words, and something in them that wasn't quite an apology, but was adjacent to one. Something she'd known for a long time that she hadn't said. My father asked Eleanor several more questions about the legal process. I answered the ones I could. Eleanor answered the rest. By the time she left, it was after 9 o'clock and the coffee had gone cold. Before she walked out, Eleanor handed me a smaller envelope, separate from the legal documents. My name on the front in my grandmother's handwriting. Her real handwriting, not typed, the loopy cursive she'd had since she was a girl. Eleanor said my grandmother had asked her to give me this privately, but that she didn't think my grandmother would object to me having it here, in this room, with my family. I opened it at the table. My grandmother had written, "The dock needs new boards on the left side." I kept meaning to get to it. "The roofer's number is in the drawer under the kitchen phone. His name is Pete, and he will not overcharge you. The loons usually come back to the same spot near the far island by mid-May. If you sit quietly, they will come closer than you'd think. Take care of it. It's yours." Granny folded the letter and put it back in the envelope. My father looked at his hands. My mother came back from the kitchen and stood in the doorway for a moment before coming to sit down. I said, "Nobody is being locked out." They all looked at me. I said, "The cabin stays in the family. Anyone who wants to come up for a weekend can come up. That's not changing." I looked at Amber when I said this. Gran didn't do this to divide us. She did it because she wanted someone to be responsible for the place. I'll be responsible for it. Amber looked at the table. Then she looked up at me. She nodded once. It wasn't much, but it was real. My father said, "I didn't know she had her own lawyer." I said, "I didn't either." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "She was always doing things her own way." There was something in his voice when he said it, not resentment. More like recognition. And maybe a little bit of grief, and underneath both of those things, something that sounded like admiration. He'd known her his whole life. He knew who she was. I drove back to my parents' house that night and lay awake in my old bedroom looking at the ceiling. The same ceiling I'd looked at as a teenager when I was trying to figure out who I was going to be. Outside the window, the neighborhood was quiet. No loons, just streetlights and the occasional car. I thought about my grandmother in September 2019 walking into Eleanor Marsh's office, deciding, signing, sealing something for a future she wouldn't be in. She would have been 77, still sharp, still doing things her own way. She hadn't told me. I've turned that over 100 times since that night, trying to understand it. I think I do understand it, actually. If she'd told me, it would have changed something between us. I might have started acting like someone who expected to inherit. I might have been more careful, more deliberate, more conscious of the role I was filling. She didn't want that. She wanted to see what I did when nobody was watching and nothing was promised. She watched for decades. I went up to the cabin in May, alone, for the first time as the person responsible for it. I drove the 2 hours north with the windows down and the radio on a CBC station that faded in and out as I got further from the city. I pulled into the gravel drive just as the light was going golden, and I sat in the car for a minute before I got out. The dock was there. The trees were there. The lake was doing what it always does, which is just to be the lake, quietly and without any drama about it. I walked around the whole property before I went inside, checked the roof, checked the trim, found the left side of the dock, just where she said. 3 boards that needed replacing, soft in a way that told me water had been getting underneath for at least a season. I made a note in my phone. Then I went inside and I found Pete's number in the drawer under the kitchen phone, exactly where she said it would be. I went down to the dock as the sun was going down. I sat at the edge with my feet over the water. The boards creaked under me in the familiar way. The far island sat quiet in the middle distance. After a while, from somewhere near the reeds, I heard a loon. Then another. I sat there until it was dark, and I couldn't see the water anymore, just the sound of it. And the stars coming out, one by one, the way they do up north, where there's nothing between you and them. My grandmother was right about the loons. If you sit still long enough, they come closer than you'd think. She was usually right about most things. I just needed 34 years and 1 dinner in Oakville to fully understand that.